Ever wondered how a nation with a tiny pre-war army became one of the most feared fighting forces on the Western Front? This is the story of the Canadian Corps in the First World War, an army forged not in the sprawling factories of industry, but in the crucible of ice, mud, and sheer grit. This is the story of how Canada's volunteers went from farmers and lumberjacks to the shock troops of the British Empire. In 1914, when the world erupted into war, Canada was a vast, sparsely populated dominion. Its permanent army was minuscule, barely a few thousand men. There was no grand military tradition, no sprawling officer academies like Sandhurst or West Point. What Canada did have was a population of tough, self-reliant individuals accustomed to harsh environments and hard labor. When the call to arms came, they answered in droves. From the bustling streets of Toronto to the quiet farms of Saskatchewan, volunteers flooded the recruitment centers. They were clerks, miners, fishermen, and students, all united by a sense of duty to the Empire and a thirst for adventure. But how do you turn this enthusiastic but amateur mob into a professional fighting force? The answer lay in a radical and uniquely Canadian approach to training. The first stop for many was Valcartier, a massive training camp hastily built in Quebec. Here, under the watchful eye of the often controversial Minister of Militia, Sam Hughes, the first Canadian contingent was born. But the real transformation began in the mud-drenched fields of England and, later, in the trenches of France and Belgium. Unlike the rigid, top-down command structure of the British and German armies, Canadian training quickly evolved to emphasize something different: the power of the small unit. Platoon and section commanders to lieutenants and sergeants were given unprecedented levels of autonomy. The thinking was simple. In the chaos of no man's land, with shells screaming and communications cut, soldiers couldn't wait for orders from a general miles behind the lines. They had to think for themselves, adapt, and seize the initiative. This philosophy was drilled into them relentlessly. Training wasn't just about marching in formation or rote bayonet drills. It was about fire and movement, using the terrain, and mastering the deadly trinity of the modern battlefield: the rifle, the machine gun, and the grenade. Canadian soldiers became experts at what we now call combined arms tactics, but at the lowest possible level. A single platoon was trained to operate like a miniature army, with its own riflemen for fire support, bombers to clear trenches with grenades, and Lewis gunners to lay down suppressing fire. This created a soldier who was a far cry from the stereotypical image of a Tommy plodding in a straight line towards machine guns. The Canadian soldier was a thinking fighter, an innovator. They learned to read the battlefield, to exploit a moment's weakness in the enemy line, and to coordinate their actions with the men on their left and right without direct orders. This emphasis on small unit initiative made them incredibly flexible and resilient. When a platoon leader was killed, a sergeant or even a corporal was expected to take command and continue the mission. This bottom-up approach to warfare was perfectly suited for the brutal reality of trench raiding. Long before they were known for massive assaults like Vimy Ridge, the Canadians earned their reputation in the dark, terrifying world of trench raids. These weren't just about snatching prisoners. They were laboratories of tactical innovation. Raids were planned and executed at the platoon level, teaching junior leaders invaluable lessons in planning, reconnaissance, and leading men under extreme pressure. They perfected the art of the creeping barrage, where artillery fire would move just ahead of the advancing infantry, creating a curtain of steel that kept the enemy's heads down. They became masters of infiltration, using the shell-pocked landscape to get in close before the enemy even knew they were there. These raids, night after night, honed their skills and built an aggressive, confident spirit. They learned that audacity and surprise were their greatest weapons. So, while the British Army was a steady, reliable steamroller, and the Americans were a rising industrial powerhouse, the Canadian Corps became something else entirely. They were a strange and deadly hybrid. They possessed the discipline and firepower of a modern army, but combined it with the initiative and adaptability of guerrilla fighters. They were a volunteer army, but their training and battlefield experience transformed them into elite shock troops. This unique identity, forged in the training camps and the bloody raids of the Western Front, was the foundation upon which their legendary reputation would be built. It was this focus on the individual soldier, the empowered junior leader, and the relentless pursuit of tactical superiority that would soon see them tasked with breaking the unbreakable lines of the Hindenburg line and leading the final charge to victory in the war's closing days. The forging was complete. The weapon was ready. The reputation of Canadian soldiers during the Great War was unjust built on their victories at places like Vimy Ridge or Passat. It was forged in the mud and the trenches, day after day, in the minds of the very men they were fighting. And as German High Command began to piece together intelligence from the front, a startling picture emerged. They looked at captured Canadian diaries, interrogated prisoners, and analyzed after-action reports from their own officers. A consistent and unsettling theme kept appearing. The Canadians were different. German tactical doctrine, like that of most armies at the time, was built on a rhythm of combat. You attack, you consolidate, you reorganize, and then you prepare for the next push or attack. It was a methodical, almost scientific approach to the chaos of the battlefield. But the Canadians, as German commanders frustratingly noted, seemed to ignore this rulebook entirely. Their battalions were described as relentless, almost unnervingly so. When they took an objective, they often didn't stop to catch their breath. They didn't pause to reset their lines in the way German doctrine predicted. They just kept coming. Imagine being a German soldier in a support trench. You've just seen your front line overwhelmed. You're expecting a lull, a moment to brace for the next phase of the assault. But then, through the smoke and haze, you see them. The Canadians are already advancing on your position, pushing forward with a momentum that defied conventional military wisdom. This wasn't recklessness. It was a calculated and terrifying form of pressure. A frontline report from a German officer described it as an unstoppable flood. He noted that even when Canadian units suffered heavy casualties, the survivors would simply reform on the move and continue the advance. This constant grinding pressure began to have a profound psychological effect. This refusal to pause created a unique tactical problem for the Germans. Their counterattack plans were often rendered obsolete before they could even be put into action. They expected to hit the Canadians while they were vulnerable, while they were reorganizing. Instead, German reserves would rush forward only to find the Canadians had already moved on, digging in further behind German lines or already assaulting the next objective. The Canadians were consistently one step ahead, not just in terms of ground gained, but in terms of the entire tempo of the battle. They were dictating the pace, forcing the Germans to react to their relentless advance rather than fighting on their own terms. The intelligence assessments piling up in Berlin started using specific words to describe Canadian units. Hartenhig meaning stubborn or tenacious, meaning ruthless or relentless, and unberechenbar, unpredictable. This last one was perhaps the most crucial. An unpredictable enemy is the most dangerous kind. You can't plan for them. You can't anticipate their next move with any certainty. German commanders began to realize that when they identified Canadian battalions opposite them in the line, the standard rules of engagement simply didn't apply. They had to prepare for anything. This reputation grew to the point where the mere presence of Canadian formations on a sector of the front was enough to cause alarm. The Canadians were being used as storm troops, the elite shock absorbers of the British Expeditionary Force. Allied High Command knew it, and more importantly, German High Command knew it. They started tracking Canadian movements with intense focus. If divisions were being pulled out of one area and reappearing in another, it was a clear signal that a major offensive was about to begin there. The Canadians had become a barometer for the coming storm. One captured diary from a Bavarian lieutenant summed it up perfectly. He wrote, "We are not fighting soldiers. We are fighting madmen. When we think they are beaten, they rise again. When we expect them to halt, they surge forward. There is no respite." This wasn't an exaggeration for dramatic effect. It was a genuine expression of the fear and bewilderment the Canadians inspired. They had broken the established mold of attritional trench warfare. They didn't just fight for ground. They fought to break the will of their opponents through sheer, unyielding forward momentum. This perception wasn't just based on anecdotes. German casualty reports from sectors facing the Canadians often showed disproportionately high losses among their own troops, even in defensive postures. The Canadians were aggressive in their patrols, masters of the trench raid, and utterly devastating in a set-piece attack. Their combination of meticulous planning, which we saw at Vimy, and this ferocious refusal to stop made them a uniquely formidable force. They weren't just taking trenches, they were psychologically dismantling the units opposite them. So, as the war dragged on, the legend grew. German soldiers would pass whispers down the line. DA. Canadier. Cindier. The Canadians are here. It was a warning. It meant the quiet days were over. It meant to prepare for an assault that wouldn't follow the predictable patterns of stop-and-start warfare. It meant they were facing an enemy who simply did not know how to quit. An enemy who, against all odds and all doctrine, just kept coming. This reputation, born from the observations of their foes, became one of the Canadians' most powerful weapons. The Italian campaign is often called the Forgotten Front of World War II. A brutal, grinding slog up the mountainous spine of Italy against some of the most determined and elite German units. But within this forgotten campaign lies an even more forgotten battle, one of the most savage and vicious of the entire war. A battle fought in darkness, dust, and rubble, where Canadian soldiers forged a fearsome reputation in blood and fire. This is the story of Ortona, the battle the Germans themselves called Little Stop. By December 1943, the Allied invasion of Italy, which had begun with such promise, had bogged down. The rugged terrain and a series of formidable German defensive lines, like the Gustav Line, had turned the advance into a meat grinder. The objective for the British 8th Army, which included the 1st Canadian Infantry Division, was to break through these defenses on the Adriatic coast and capture the port town of Ortona. The plan seemed straightforward, a swift, decisive punch to clear the way towards Rome. But the Germans had other ideas. Defending Ortona were elite paratroopers from the 1st Parachute Division, the famed Fallschirmjäger. These were not conscripts. They were battle-hardened, ideologically committed veterans, masters of defensive warfare. They were ordered by Hitler himself to hold Ortona to the last man. The stage was set for a clash of titans. Before the Canadians could even reach the town, they had to cross a deep, steep-sided ravine known simply as the Gully. This natural obstacle was the perfect killing ground, and the German paratroopers had expertly fortified it. For 6 days, the Canadians launched repeated, desperate attacks. The fighting was at point-blank range, a brutal contest of grenades, machine guns, and bayonets. Men from the Loyal Edmonton Regiment and the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada bled for every inch of ground. The Gully became a landscape of death, littered with the bodies of friend and foe. Casualties were staggering. Entire companies were decimated. Yet, with sheer grit and unimaginable courage, the Canadians clawed their way across. They had paid a heavy price, but they had broken the first line of defense. Now, Ortona itself loomed before them. What awaited them inside the town would make the horror of the Gully seem like a prelude. On December 20th, the Canadians entered Ortona. They expected a ruined, but largely empty town. Instead, they walked into a meticulously prepared trap. The Germans had used demolition charges to blow up buildings, creating massive rubble piles that blocked the main streets, funneling the advancing Canadians into pre-sighted kill zones. Every street was covered by machine guns, anti-tank guns, and mortars. Snipers lurked in every window, every pile of debris. Tanks were useless in the narrow blocked-off streets. This wasn't going to be a battle of maneuver. It was going to be a war of attrition. Fought house by house, room by room. The fighting in Ortona descended into a primeval form of warfare. Conventional tactics were thrown out the window. Progress was measured not in miles, but in individual buildings. A typical engagement would start with a Canadian platoon trying to cross a street, only to be cut down by a hail of machine gun fire from a concealed position. The survivors would scramble for cover in the nearest bombed-out building, and the real fight would begin. It was a three-dimensional battlefield. Death could come from a cellar below, a window across the street, or a sniper's nest in a church tower 3 blocks away. The atmosphere was a suffocating mix of cordite, dust, and the metallic smell of blood. The constant explosions and gunfire created a deafening roar that was punctuated by terrifying silences, where the only sounds were the scuttling of rats or the soft groan of a dying man. Visibility was often reduced to mere feet by the thick dust kicked up by shelling and collapsing buildings. In this chaotic environment, distinguishing friend from foe was a nightmare. The German paratroopers were masters of camouflage and deception, often using captured Allied weapons to sow confusion. Canadian soldiers spoke of the Germans as ghosts, materializing out of the rubble to attack, then vanishing just as quickly. The psychological strain was immense. Men fought in a state of heightened adrenaline and sheer exhaustion, knowing that every doorway, every dark corner, could be their last. Faced with the deadly, impassable streets, the Canadians had to innovate or die, and so they invented a brutal but effective new tactic: mouse-holing. Instead of entering a house through the front door, a guaranteed death trap, they would use explosives like beehive charges to blow a hole in the wall of an adjacent house. They would then storm through the opening, clearing the room with grenades and submachine guns, and then repeat the process, blowing a hole into the next house and the next. This allowed them to advance through entire city blocks without ever setting foot on the deadly streets. It turned the city's connected buildings into a series of interconnected hunting grounds. Imagine the sheer terror of this. You're a German paratrooper, huddled in a darkened room, listening to the battle rage outside. Suddenly, the wall beside you explodes inwards in a shower of brick and plaster. Before the dust even settles, shadowy figures pour through the hole, the muzzle flashes of their Sten guns lighting up the darkness. It's a fight at arm's length, a desperate, vicious struggle in a space no bigger than a living room. Hand-to-hand combat was common. Shovels, knives, rifle butts, anything could become a weapon. This was the reality of mouse. The Canadians became predators, hunting the German defenders from room to room, floor to floor, turning their own fortified positions into tombs. The Germans, in turn, learned to counter this tactic. They would booby-trap furniture, leave mines in stairwells, and wait in ambush on the other side of a wall they expected the Canadians to breach. Every house became a complex puzzle of death. One of the most famous and poignant moments of the battle occurred on Christmas Day. In the middle of this hell on earth, the men of the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada found a brief respite. While one platoon held the line, the others rotated back to a partially standing church. Their quartermaster had managed to scrounge up enough supplies for a Christmas dinner. So, amidst the rubble and the constant threat of death, these soldiers sat down at makeshift tables. They sang carols, shared what little they had, and for a few precious hours, remembered what it was to be human. An organist played Silent Night as the sounds of battle raged just a few hundred yards away. It's a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit. A small moment of peace and brotherhood in the heart of unimaginable violence. But the truce was temporary. Soon after, the men picked up their rifles and went back to the fighting, many to their deaths. After 8 days of relentless, savage combat, the tide began to turn. The Canadians, through sheer determination and their bloody mouse-holing tactics, had systematically cleared most of the town. The German paratroopers, though they had fought with incredible skill and ferocity, were being bled white. Their losses were unsustainable, and the strategic value of holding the Ruble of Ortona was diminishing. On the night of December 28th, under the cover of darkness, the surviving Germans quietly withdrew from the town. The next morning, Canadian patrols moved through the silent, devastated streets, finding them eerily empty. The battle was over. The cost was astronomical. The 1st Canadian Division suffered nearly 2,300 casualties in December alone, with over 500 killed, just to take this one town. Ortona was left a shattered ruin, a testament to the ferocity of the fighting. The Canadians had won, but it was a victory paid for in blood. They had faced one of the most elite units in the German army in a battle of its own choosing and had come out on top. Their performance at Ortona earned them a fearsome reputation among their enemies, and a place of honor in the annals of military history. They had proven themselves to be among the finest street fighters of the Second World War. The ghosts of Ortona, as the Germans called them, had haunted the paratroopers out of their fortress. The story of Ortona is more than just a battle. It's a story of courage, innovation, and sacrifice. It is a reminder that victory in war often comes down to the grit and determination of the individual soldier, fighting for his comrades in the most horrific conditions imaginable. Today, Ortona has been rebuilt, but the scars of the battle remain, both in the landscape and in the memory of the Canadian and Italian people. The war in Northwest Europe had been a story of lightning advances since the breakout from Normandy. It seemed like nothing could stop the Allied armies. But as the autumn of 1944 set in, that forward momentum hit a wall of mud, water, and stubborn resistance. The port of Antwerp, one of the largest in the world, had been captured and talked a miracle. But there was a catch. The port was useless as long as the Germans controlled the 60-mile-long Scheldt estuary that connected it to the sea. Opening the Scheldt became the top priority, and the brutal job fell to the 1st Canadian Army. This would become one of the most grueling and overlooked campaigns of the entire war. Welcome back to our series on the final year of the Second World War. Today, we're diving into the Battle of the Scheldt, a fight defined not by grand armored thrusts, but by sheer, bloody-minded attrition against a determined enemy and an unforgiving landscape. It was a battle fought in conditions that defy imagination, a watery, flooded hellscape where progress was measured in yards, and every yard was paid for in blood. The geography of the Scheldt estuary is a nightmare for an attacking army. It's a maze of islands, dikes, canals, and flooded lowlands called pole. The Germans, masters of defense, had turned this landscape into a fortress. They held key positions like the Breskens pocket south of the estuary, the South Beveland Peninsula, and the heavily fortified island of Walcheren, which sat like a cork in the mouth of the river. Their guns commanded every approach. For the soldiers of the 1st Canadian Army, which included British, Polish, and other Allied units under its command, there would be no easy way forward. The operation began on October 2nd, and from the start, it was a meat grinder. The Canadians, attacking the Breskens pocket, an area mockingly nicknamed Scheldt Fortress, south by the Germans, found themselves in a landscape of waterlogged fields and sky-high dikes. The Germans had blown the dikes, flooding the polders and turning the roads into narrow, exposed causeways. Every advance meant wading through chest-deep, freezing water or inching along a dike under a constant storm of machine gun and mortar fire. The mud was a living entity. It was a thick, black, clinging slime that swallowed boots, jammed weapons, and exhausted men to the point of collapse. Vehicles became utterly useless, meaning every single box of ammunition, every ration, every stretcher with a wounded man had to be carried by hand over miles of treacherous ground. And then there was the rain, a cold, relentless autumn rain that fell for days on end, soaking everyone to the bone, turning trenches into muddy graves, and making life utterly miserable. German soldiers who survived the battle spoke of the Canadians with a mixture of fear and respect. They described them as relentless, grimly determined fighters who just kept coming, no matter the cost. One German officer wrote that the Canadians seemed to be made of different stuff, advancing with a grim inevitability that unnerved his battle-hardened troops. They attacked through mud that should have been impassable, and through weather that would have stopped any other army in its tracks. The psychological toll was immense. Imagine lying in a slit trench that is slowly filling with icy water, while artillery shells rain down around you. You're cold, you're wet, you're exhausted. And you know that at any moment, you have to get up and charge across an open field toward an unseen enemy who has you zeroed in. This was the daily reality for the men fighting in the Scheldt. Casualties were horrific. Entire companies were chewed up in a single day's fighting. Medics worked frantically in the mud, trying to save men while under fire themselves. Getting the wounded back to aid stations was a Herculean task, often taking teams of 6 to 8 man-hours to carry one stretcher across the flooded terrain. One of the most notorious parts of the campaign was the fight for the causeway connecting South Beveland to Walcheren Island. It was a narrow strip of land, a little over 1,000 yards long and only 40 yards wide, with mudflats on either side. The Germans had it perfectly sighted with machine guns, mortars, and artillery. Attacking it was described by one Canadian soldier as a Cardassian-sponsored suicide trip. The Black Watch of Canada was ordered to take the causeway. They advanced into a hurricane of fire. Men were cut down in waves. The attack was a disaster, a brutal, bloody failure that left the battalion shattered. It became a symbol of the futility and horror of the Scheldt fighting. Yet, even after this, the attacks continued. Other units tried, each time gaining a few more precious, bloody yards. The Germans, equally exhausted and battered, were just as stubborn. They knew that if Walcheren fell, the port of Antwerp would be opened, and the Allied supply situation would be solved, sealing Germany's fate. The Canadians learned and adapted. They started using amphibious vehicles like the Buffalo and the Terrapin to navigate the flooded polders, bypassing fortified roads and surprising the German defenders. These vehicles could swim across flooded fields and then climb up the dikes, bringing infantry and supplies to where they were needed most. This tactical innovation was key to breaking the stalemate in places like the Breskin's Pocket. The night attacks became legendary. The Canadians would use the thick autumn fog and darkness to their advantage. German accounts from the time are filled with terrified descriptions of ghostly figures emerging silently from a fog so thick it felt like it could suffocate a man. These phantom attacks were often preceded by terrifyingly accurate artillery barrages. The Canadian and British gunners were masters of their craft. They developed techniques to pinpoint German positions with deadly precision, even in the worst conditions. German prisoners were often shocked at how the Allied artillery seemed to know exactly where they were trying to hide, raining down shells with pinpoint accuracy that shattered morale as much as it shattered bodies. To finally crack the nut of Walcheren Island, a three-pronged assault was planned. The Canadians would continue their push across the causeway. The British 52nd Lowland Division would conduct an amphibious assault across the West Scheldt to attack from the south, and in a daring move, British commandos would land from the sea. At Westkapelle, where the RF had bombed the massive sea dike, flooding the island to silence many of the German gun batteries. The landings were hellish. The commandos landing at Westkapelle had to storm ashore in the face of withering fire from the remaining German positions. The water was littered with obstacles and mines. Their landing craft were torn apart by shell fire, but they kept coming, storming the breaches in the dike and fighting their way into the town. It was a battle of close-quarter combat, fighting from house to house, bunker to bunker. By early November, after more than a month of continuous, savage fighting, the last German resistance in the Scheldt estuary was finally silenced. The cost had been staggering. The 1st Canadian Army suffered over 12,800 casualties, with nearly half of them being Canadians. These were men who had survived Normandy, the Falaise Gap, and the chase across France, only to fall in the mud of the Scheldt. Their sacrifice is often overshadowed by other, more famous battles like the Battle of the Bulge, but it was absolutely critical to the Allied victory. On November 28, 1944, the first Allied supply convoy, led by the Canadian-built freighter Fort Cataraqui, steamed into the port of Antwerp. The logistical lifeline of the Allied armies was secure. The final push into Germany could now be sustained. The soldiers who fought and died in the mud and water of the Scheldt had given the Allies the key to unlock the heart of the Reich. They fought one of the dirtiest, toughest, and most vital campaigns of the war, and their grim, bloody-minded determination in the face of impossible odds deserves to be remembered.